The Galloglass were among the most terrible mercenaries in history. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, these warriors changed Irish history and warfare decisively. They were truly professional, meticulously chosen from the strongest, and armed with head-splitting axes. The Galloglass were an elite warrior infantry unit that was both highly effective in battle and ideal for protective duties. They began as simple mercenaries migrating from the rugged shores of northwest Scotland and grew into a sedentary military class in Ireland. Their familial networks provided all of Ireland with deadly warriors capable of matching English knights. In this video, we look at how contemporary historiography explains who the Galloglass were, what made them so successful, and how they fought. In 1166, Dermot mac Murrough, Diarmait mac Murchada, King of Leinster, was ousted by Ireland's High King, Rory O'Connor, Ruaidhrí Ua Conchobair. He sought to England for assistance in regaining his throne and obtained Anglo-Norman mercenaries in exchange for a pledge of fealty to Henry II, the English monarch. Dermot mac Murrough regained his crown, but he had made a deal with the devil. Over the next few years, an increasing number of Englishmen arrived in Ireland, until King Henry landed with an army in October 1171 to take possession of the entire island. This is now known as the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland. The local chiefs were quickly drawn into a brutal conquering battle. Worse, they lacked strongly armed and highly trained warriors to face the Anglo-Norman knights. This is why they eventually turned to the Galloglass. These soldiers came from the Insegal, or Foreigner Isles, which are the islands and coastal districts of Scotland's western coastlines. This rugged territory was made up of numerous small communities and was a melting pot of Celtic and Norse ancestry, which had resulted in hardy and weather-beaten people who were well accustomed to the difficulties of life and conflict. Although foreign mercenaries had been present in Ireland for some time, the Galloglass are first referenced in Irish annals in the mid-13th century. Some of them had previously settled in Ireland, primarily in Ulster. They were ferocious fighters, with many having served for their Scottish feudal lords as military personnel. The Galloglass differed significantly from other types of warriors recruited by Gaelic lords. In the late medieval period, lords typically relied on light infantry, known as cairn, Southern, and light cavalry. Both were ideally adapted to small-scale combat, cattle raiding, and guerrilla fighting, which were common in early and high medieval Ireland. They were, however, no match for Norman men-at-arms, and unsuitable for open fights, which were becoming increasingly common. Outmatched Irish light infantry faced Norman knights who had been trained since childhood to fight on foot and horseback with sword and lance. Clearly, there was a need for stronger forces. Hiring the Galloglass was a sensible idea, and their arrival boosted the Irish resistance significantly. Nonetheless, authority of the island was quickly split between Irish dynasties and Anglo-Irish rulers. As the conflict continued, Scottish warriors sought salary from other masters, lingered, and eventually settled in Ireland. The Galloglass demonstrated their ability to deal with Anglo-Norman men-at-arms during Robert the Bruce's, killed by his brother Edward, invasion of Ireland during the First War of Scottish Independence. According to historian John Marsden, this encounter proved the capabilities of this new type of warrior and marked the beginning of the Galloglass era. Their growth was quick. Within a century, they had progressed from occasional hired mercenaries to a warrior class. Luke McInerney, a medieval Gaelic Ireland expert, describes how they were organized into hereditary professional kindreds whose branches were settled in various lordships in Ireland. Galloglass families gradually created networks centered on professional military duty, were linked to noble patrons, developed an esprit de corps, and began to compete with one another. Their commanders, known as constables, became lords' councillors and were given riches and territory in exchange for their services, much like other Gaelic aristocratic professions, such as poets and historians. By 1400, they had fully assimilated into Irish society and were a part of the feudal system. From the 14th to the 16th centuries, the Galloglass were an integral part of practically every military force in Ireland. They formed an excellent bodyguard during peacetime, and an elite vanguard during wartime. The demand for such fighters surged, and Anglo-Irish lords, and, eventually, the English government of Ireland followed suit. Every lord soon developed his own force of heavy troops, making a lord without a Galloglass plane uncompetitive. This propensity accelerated the expansion of Galloglass kindreds over the island. The founding Galloglass family quickly became too few to meet the strong demand for exceptional combatants. According to Gerard A. Hayes McCoy, the historian who set the groundwork for modern Galloglass research, they only supplied the highest levels of their ranks, such as constables. After the 13th century, the majority of their forces were drawn from the native Irish populace. Unfortunately, the historical archives of medieval Irish history do not contain even a portion of any Galloglass instruction manual. Therefore, there is no genuine proof of how a recruit would acquire the expertise required to practice his vocation. Nonetheless, there must have been some form of training or apprenticeship. Several texts from the 16th century state that their sons learn to be men of war from the age of 16 years and be continually practiced in toils thereof. Or, they live in a kindred, the father instructing the son, or brother, and he his cousin, or friend. So the Galloglass were true military families, and sons and nephews were most likely trained in a close-knit setting to become warriors like their dads. Needless to say, this type of schooling was essentially conservative, which could explain why the Galloglass of the 16th century remained so identical to their ancestors 300 years before. At this point, it is crucial to emphasize that much of what we know about Galloglass military culture comes from English sources written in the 16th century, providing an outside perspective. Edmund Spenser, an English poet and playwright, portrays them as wearing a quilted jacket under a tunic of mail that reaches the leg, and wielding a great broad axe. Albrecht Dürer drew a current representation of the Galloglass around 1521. The artist simply identified these men as war men of Ireland beyond England, but scholars agree that the painting depicts 2 Galloglass and 3 armed attendants. Overall, the written and pictorial sources provide a fairly accurate account of the Galloglass. They are described as men of great strength and stature, wearing chainmail over a linen shirt, a bassinet-style helmet, and carrying a long axe. This combat axe is constantly emphasized as a distinguishing feature, despite the fact that the Galloglass used a wide range of armament, including spears, bows, two-handed swords, and numerous sidearms. By the mid-16th century, the Galloglass warrior and his axe became inseparable. Because the Galloglass weapons were made by local smiths, they varied significantly in size and design, although they often featured long handles, sometimes resembling pole axes. Wielding an axe efficiently is a tough ability to perfect because it requires both precision and force to deal significant damage, especially when fighting in formation. This could only be accomplished by extensive training with high standards and a focus on discipline in action. The Galloglass were organized into battles, Gaelic, Corahad, of approximately 80 men, or 180 or more when counting their harness bearers, who were essentially squires. Each was escorted by at least one of these armed attendants and a page. The squires accompanied their lords to combat as skirmishers, armed with spears or bow and arrows. The Galloglass were highly effective for the duration of their existence. They apparently used their long-handled axes to bring down mounted knights, which was quite amazing. According to historian Muriosa Prendergast, they were always posted in the most dangerous location. As raids and ambushes became a larger feature of battle in Ireland, this was likely the most common fighting experience for a Galloglass. Typically, raiding parties depended on surprises. In this scenario, the rearguard was the most perilous location. The Galloglass kept their stand and protected their allies' withdrawal by weathering counterattacks and pursuit. In battle, the Galloglass built a so-called Castle of Bones, a robust, densely packed configuration in the midst of the battle line. Standing firm, they offered cover for light infantry, archers, and regular cavalry. The latter reached out from this protected location, throwing javelins at the adversary before retreating to cover. On the offensive, a war for Galloglass might unleash a massive amount of deadly power. After the squires had fought for a bit, they drew back, and the Galloglass charged forward with their axes to break up the enemy formation. Usually, the conflict was brief and intense. When facing defeat, the axemen again formed a defensive screen, allowing their colleagues to flee. For themselves, this could end badly because their heavy equipment made it difficult to retreat fast. Because the Galloglass served rulers of various colors, warriors from different branches of the same kindred occasionally clashed in battle. In such cases, professional obligations frequently take precedence over family togetherness. This made Galloglasses perfect mercenaries. They were formidable fighters, unencumbered by local attachments and commitments. This, however, came with a price. The Galloglass, like all mercenaries, fought for a fee. When recruited for intermittent offensive combat, they were frequently given the lion's share of the plunder, as well as board and accommodation by billeting them in the houses of the lord's tenants, which was rarely a pleasant experience for their hosts. When a battalion of Galloglass was needed for a longer amount of time as bodyguards or for a similar purpose, a more formal arrangement was required. In families where the position of constable became hereditary, such as the Mac Sweeneys, the main line of the family was frequently given land in exchange for fighting men. In many situations, an annual payment was made in the form of livestock or other items, and in the 15th and 16th centuries, actual coin was occasionally used, but this was not the norm. When long-term vassalage to a single ruler grew more widespread, elaborate recompense mechanisms replaced one-time payments for short-term deployments. According to John Marsden, the Galloglass's weapons and look stayed substantially unaltered from medieval times until the 1580s, despite refinements in fighting skills and significant changes in organization. Galloglasses were progressively used by a broader range of paymasters who pitted Galloglasses against each other. The fight of Knockdoe in 1504, the greatest fight ever fought between Irishmen, and probably the most famous of the Galloglass Wars. At a time when nearly every lord in Ireland had a vassal Galloglass clan, two armies mostly composed of these soldiers engaged at Knockdoe, Knocktuath, the Hill of the Axes, some 13 kilometers outside of Galway. According to historian Hayes McCoy, this was the greatest fight fought by these professional axemen. On August 19th, the King's deputy, Gerald Fitzgerald, Geroid Moore, Earl of Kildare, assembled an army of approximately 6,000 soldiers on the slope of the Hill of the Axes, the majority of whom were Galloglass. He gathered supporters to overthrow his ambitious brother-in-law, Ulick Burke of Clan Ricard, Wiliag Fionn de Burca. Burke and his friends brought approximately 4,000 soldiers, the majority of whom were also Galloglass. They finally came into view at daybreak, and Burke's Galloglass assaulted the waiting army without hesitation. The heavy soldiers advanced through a barrage of arrows until they were completely engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Only after a while did the Earl's Galloglass's numerical superiority become apparent, as they gradually engulfed the men advancing up the hill. The conflict raged on until axes and mail turned scarlet, and the ground was covered in blood. After several hours, Burke's soldiers had little choice but to withdraw. As the Earl's men pursued them down the Clare River, one of them was battered with the shaft of a revolver. This is the first mention of a pistol in Irish history. So, during the Galloglass's biggest fight, their enemy may have made his first appearance in Ireland. In the 16th century, the Galloglass experienced a final surge in popularity by English-born officials who used it to subordinate Irish and Anglo-Irish lords to the English crown. But then their demise came quickly. As European armies became more reliant on long pikes and handguns, the equipment required on the battlefield evolved. In the face of gunpowder weaponry and conventional armies made up of thousands of combatants, the Galloglass's amazing fighting talents were rendered ineffective, and they simply could not offer the numbers required to face an army that Queen Elizabeth I could muster. There was no longer a need for hand-picked elite infantrymen in modern warfare, which was all about discipline, drill, and numbers, known as pike and shot. If you liked this video, please consider becoming a Patreon. We're aiming to accomplish our monthly target of $600, which will help us cover the expense of the detailed artwork in our videos.